Welcome to Eastward Archives, where we explore yesterday to understand today.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into a stack of sources to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, giving you a shortcut to being truly well-informed.
And today, we're tackling a subject of almost unimaginable scale and, frankly, brutality.
We're heading to the Eastern Front of World War II.
Yeah, a conflict where the human cost is it's staggering. Millions upon millions died, often in conditions that, well, they defy belief.
And right at the heart of that conflict is the Battle of Stalingrad.
Not just a battle, really. More like an epic, grinding struggle. It's often called the bloodiest, the fiercest battle of the entire war. Maybe even all of human history.
The sheer ferocity, the casualties, it's just mind-boggling.
Absolutely.
And that's the backdrop for our focus today. Our mission in this deep dive is to explore a really pivotal moment within that struggle, Operation Uranus.
Right. We want to unpack why it was so important, maybe compare it a bit to the later Battle of Kursk, and really dig into the incredible planning behind it.
The planning, the intelligence work, the logistics, how the Soviets managed to prepare this huge game-changing operation basically right under the noses of the Axis forces.
And critically, we need to understand the context. What was the situation like for the Soviet Union generally? And maybe more importantly, what was it like inside Stalingrad itself?
We want to give you a sense of that, maybe through the eyes of just a regular Red Army soldier caught up in it all, get that visceral feel for the daily reality on the ground.
To do that, we've pulled together a pretty diverse range of sources. We've got military university presentations, detailed historical analyses.
But also personal memoirs, first-hand accounts from soldiers on both sides, which can be incredibly poignant.
Exactly. And even tactical maps to help visualize the battlefield. The aim is to give you a multifaceted view, cutting through the complexity to get to those key insights.
So to really grasp the genius and the sheer audacity of Operation Uranus, we first need to understand what came before it. We need to immerse ourselves in that relentless, street-by-street hellscape of Stalingrad.
That crucible, where the plan was forged. It all started, in a way, with the German offensive codenamed Operation Blau, or Blue, launched June 28, 1942.
Initially aimed at the Caucasus oil fields, wasn't it? Stalingrad seemed almost secondary at first.
Yeah, it's fascinating how Hitler's focus shifted. What started as maybe a flank protection mission, a secondary objective, became this obsession. Stalingrad had to be taken.
And that initial German advance, Operation Blau, it was devastatingly successful, wasn't it?
Oh, incredibly so. Soviet forces were often stretched thin across those vast steppes. They offered what the Germans saw as, little resistance.
Soviet attempts to form new defensive lines just kept failing.
They were just overwhelmed. The speed, the power of the blitzkrieg. Two major Soviet pockets were formed and destroyed very quickly, near Kharkov and then Milarovo.
Voronezh fell July 5th, Rostov on July 24th.
The German army seemed unstoppable, just slicing through Soviet territory, pushing hard towards the Volga River and the Caucasus oil.
But then came a decision. A blunder, really, from Hitler himself.
A critical one, July 13th. He diverted the 4th Panzer Army, a powerful armored force, south towards the Caucasus.
Pulled them away from the push towards Stalingrad.
Exactly. It significantly weakened the 6th Army's drive on the city, which was, at that point, only a few dozen kilometers away.
And that diversion, maybe unintentionally, bought Stalingrad some time.
Precious time. Time the defenders desperately needed to brace for the storm that was coming.
And they needed every second, because Stalingrad wasn't just some provincial town. This was a major industrial city.
Huge. It stretched, 20 miles along the western bank of the Volga, a real powerhouse, home to massive factories.
Like the Stalingrad tractor factory, which wasn't just building tractors anymore.
Right. It was churning out T-34 tanks, sometimes literally driving them straight off the assembly line and into the battle lines forming just outside the factory gates. Incredible.
And there was the barricades factory for guns, the Red October steel plant. This city could make its own weapons, even while under siege.
Its strategic value was just immense. Control Stalingrad, you control the Volga River.
Which was the main artery for oil transport for the Soviets. Cutting that off
would cripple the Soviet war effort. The Germans knew it, and Stalin certainly knew it. He issued that decree. The city was to be held at all costs.
Not just a suggestion. This was Order Number 227, July 28, 1942. The famous rallying cry, not a step back.
Nishagum Nazad. And it had that incredibly stark, powerful embodiment. There was no land beyond the Volga. Fight here or die here. There was literally nowhere else to go.
So Under that absolute order, what was life actually like for the average Red Army soldier thrown into that furnace? Can you paint a picture of that urban hellscape?
Urban hellscape is, sadly, the right term. Sources talk about fierce, close-quarters combat and constant direct assaults on civilians in aerial raids.
Yeah.
It was the epitome of brutal urban warfare.
German General Hans Duer described it, didn't he?
He did. He called it a bitter battle for every house, workshop, water tower, waged without equal even in the First World War. A fight for every room, every floor, every pile of rubble.
The Germans had their own name for it, Rattenkrieg.
Rat war, yeah. Fighting in sewers, cellars, shattered buildings. Visibility down to a few feet sometimes. Death could come from literally anywhere above, below, behind. A truly suffocating, terrifying environment.
And the Soviets, despite being pushed back, they adapted their tactics to this nightmare, didn't they?
They had to. One key tactic was hugging the enemy. Staying as close to the German lines as humanly possible.
Why? To negate the Luftwaffe's air power.
Precisely. If Soviet and German soldiers were locked in combat only yards apart, German bombers couldn't strike Soviet positions without hitting their own men. It forced the fight into the close quarters where the Soviets hoped to level the playing field.
Desperate, but effective.
And they relied heavily on night attacks. Moving under the cover of darkness, again, nullified German air superiority. Plus, it had a huge psychological impact on the Germans.
Keeping them constantly on edge, never knowing when the next assault would come from the shadows.
Exactly. The Soviets turned the drones into their weapon. They became masters of urban guerrilla warfare, using every shell hole, every bombed-out basement.
The defense was just desperate. You mentioned civilians earlier.
Yeah, the 62nd Army, tasked with defending the city core, often relied on civilians, including women, even children sometimes, to dig trenches, build fortifications, first in the summer heat, then in the freezing winter.
And some were even sent into battle.
There are accounts, shocking accounts, of civilians being sent into the lines without rifles, told to pick one up from a fallen comrade. It speaks volumes about the sheer desperation.
There's that incredible story of the 177th Anti-Aircraft Regiment, too.
Ah, yes. Partly composed of young women, factory workers mostly. On August 23rd and 24th, as German tanks first rolled into the northern suburbs, this regiment stood its ground.
They engaged the tanks directly with their anti-aircraft guns.
They did, lowered the barrels and fired point blank. They claimed the destruction of 28 German tanks, completely surprising the German units who weren't expecting such fierce resistance from an AA unit.
And 2 women from that regiment were decorated for bravery, weren't they? A rare thing.
Very rare at that stage. It highlights the all-hands-on-deck nature of the defense. And the individual acts of resistance are legendary.
Like the grain elevator.
A towering structure near the southern tip of the city. About 50 Red Army soldiers, completely cut off, held it for 5 days.
Against 10 German assaults.
10 separate assaults. They fought until they literally ran out of ammunition and water. When the Germans finally took it, they only found 40 bodies.
But the fighting had been so intense, the Germans thought there must have been many more defenders.
Exactly. And in a final act of defiance, the Soviets burned tons of grain stored there to deny it to the enemy.
Then there's Mamayev Kurgan Hill.
The dominant height overlooking the city. Changed hands countless times, weeks of relentless fighting. Sometimes it was hard to tell who was attacking and who was defending. The lines were so fluid and the combat so ferocious.
And Pavlov's house, probably the most famous example.
Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a handful of men fortified a 4-story apartment building overlooking a key square.
They surrounded it with mines, set up machine guns.
And held out for about 60 days. 60 days. Against constant attacks. It's famously said they killed more enemy soldiers than the Germans lost in taking Paris.
Whether that's literally true or not, it became a symbol. The Germans marked it as Festung Fortress on their maps, a tiny island of defiance.
And you can't talk about Stalingrad without mentioning the snipers.
Vasily Zaitsev.
The shepherd from the Urals became a national hero. He and his students used the ruins as their hunting ground. Perfect sniper territory.
He killed 32 Germans in just one 10-day period, reportedly.
An incredible tally. His reputation became so fearsome, the Germans supposedly flew in their own top sniper, an SS Colonel Heinz Thorwald, specifically to hunt him down. A sniper duel amidst the ruins.
So amidst this heroism and tactical adaptation, the sheer physical and psychological toll must have been immense on both sides.
Unimaginable. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, typhus, diphtheria, thanks to the lack of sanitation, contaminated water, and scant medical supplies.
And the rat.
Oh, hordes of them, not just spreading disease, but adding to the misery. There's that bizarre detail about them chewing through electrical wiring in tanks sometimes.
Just shows the level of decay and chaos. And flies, too, making wounds fester.
And winter hit, and it hit hard. Temperatures dropping to minus 40 Celsius, minus 40.
Frostbite, gangrene. Soldiers literally freezing to death in their foxholes.
On top of that, starvation. Food and ammunition shortages became critical, especially for the Germans later on after the encirclement.
The Sixth Army needed 700 tons of supplies a day just to function.
And in that first week of the airlift attempt, they received only 350 tons total for the entire week. It wasn't a shortage. It was planned starvation by incompetence or indifference from high command.
And the Soviets used psychological warfare, too, didn't they?
Relentlessly, broadcasting over loudspeakers hidden in the ruins. That chilling message. Every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies in Russia. Stalingrad, mask raised.
Repeated over and over, interspersed with a ticking clock sound.
And that haunting melody they called the Tango of Death. Imagine hearing that day after day while you're freezing, starving, watching your comrades die. It was designed to break spirits.
So what kept the Soviet soldiers going? What was their motivation in this meat grinder?
Well, it's complex.
Right.
There was undoubtedly a powerful, genuine desire to fight for their homeland, for their families, especially fueled by reports of German atrocities against civilians.
Manhunts, executions. The brutality of the occupation was well documented in Stalingrad's papers.
That created a deep hatred for the invaders, a real raw motivation to defend their city, their lives, a fight for survival against an existential threat.
But it wasn't just patriotism, was it? There were harsher realities.
Absolutely. Let's be clear, not all sacrifice was voluntary. The Soviet command faced serious morale issues, especially early on, and they used brutal measures to maintain discipline.
Order number 227 again, not a step back.
It explicitly called for blocking detachments, positioned behind unreliable units, with orders to execute on the spot panickers and cowards. No retreat allowed, even if it meant being shot by your own side.
And the penal companies.
Strafbats. Filled with soldiers accused of cowardice or political offenses, sent to the most dangerous sectors, often poorly armed, basically used as human mine clearers or assault troops expected to die. Cannon fodder.
And here's a point that really underscores the situation for the average soldier. Did they even know about the bigger plan? About Uranus?
Almost certainly not. The planning for Operation Uranus was conducted under the strictest secrecy. The average Red Army soldier fighting house to house in Stalingrad had no idea their desperate, bloody sacrifice was buying time for this massive encirclement.
They were just trying to survive the next hour, the next day, unaware they were the bait in a giant trap.
It's quite staggering, that level of secrecy and compartmentalization. They were fighting blind, in a way, as far as the grand strategy went.
Okay, so against that backdrop of utter devastation, how did the Soviets pivot? How did they go from this desperate defense to planning such an audacious, complex offensive? This is where we get into the seeds of Operation Uranus.
Right, and it starts with a shift in Soviet high command. For a long time, Stalin's incompetent interference in military matters was notorious. The Kharkov disaster in May '42 was a prime example, costing hundreds of thousands of lives needlessly.
But Stalingrad seemed to change something in him.
It appears so. By August 1942, sources suggest Stalin showed considerable restraint. He essentially told his top generals, Zhukov and Vasilevsky, figure out a plan to relieve Stalingrad. He gave them more freedom.
He stepped back a bit.
He did. And that trust was placed in figures like Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who'd just been made Deputy Supreme Commander. Zhukov is often credited with developing the core concept, quote, coldly evolved a strategy in which Stalingrad became the bait of a mighty trap.
This wasn't just a counterpunch. It was sophisticated strategic thinking.
Very much so. Almost, you could say, more German in its style than previous Soviet operations. They were learning, adapting, reviving concepts like deep operations, the idea of striking deep into the enemy's rear areas.
Concepts that had been suppressed during Stalin's purges in the 1930s.
Exactly. Those purges had ripped out the heart of the Red Army's experienced officer corps, including many proponents of deep battle theory. Now necessity was forcing its revival. This was the reemergence of operational art.
And a key part of that art was identifying the enemy's weak spot.
Which was glaringly obvious in hindsight. The flanks of the German Sixth Army, stretching out north and south of Stalingrad across the open steppe, were held primarily by Allied troops, Romanians, Hungarians, Italians.
And these units were vulnerable.
Critically so. Overstretched, often holding vast fronts. One Romanian division might be responsible for 12 miles of line. They were poorly equipped, especially with anti-tank weapons effective against the Soviet T-34s.
They had almost nothing that could reliably stop a T-34.
Pretty much. And on top of that, morale was often low. They were far from home, poorly supplied, bearing the brunt of the harsh conditions. It was a disaster waiting to happen.
And didn't the Germans' own reserves have problems? That Panzer Division?
Ah, yes, the 22nd Panzer Division. It was earmarked to reinforce the Romanian Third Army on the northern flank. But when the time came, many of its tanks were simply inoperative.
Not due to combat.
No. Lack of fuel, lack of maintenance, and incredibly because rats nesting in the straw used to protect the tanks from frost had chewed through much of the internal electrical wiring.
Sidelined by rodents before the battle even began, you couldn't make it up.
It highlights the logistical chaos and desperation even on the German side before Uranus hit.
So the weak points are identified. But mobilizing the forces needed for a massive pincer movement, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks. How do you do that secretly?
Through maskirovka, the Russian art of military deception.
More than just camouflage.
Oh, much more. It's about concealment, disguise, diversion, misinformation, treated as a high-level operational art. Uranus was really the Soviets' first large-scale successful deception operation.
And they learned vital lessons from it for the future.
Immensely valuable lessons. The planning was done under utmost secrecy, even, as we said, from their own troops fighting in the city. A total blackout.
How did they achieve the strategic deception?
One key element was initially moving forces northwards, giving the Germans the impression the Red Army was reinforcing the Moscow sector. A classic misdirection.
A big change from early war when Stalin dismissed warnings about German intentions.
A huge change. He learned the hard way, tragically, with Operation Barbarossa and Blau. Now he seemed to trust his intelligence and his general's deception plans much more.
And Soviet intelligence itself was improving.
Dramatically. While maybe not as impactful for Uranus planning itself, networks like the Lucy Psi ring would later give Stalin incredible insights, like the exact start date for Kursk.
While German intelligence was increasingly flying blind.
Yes. Due to better Soviet security, counterintelligence shutting down German spy networks, stricter radio discipline making signals and intelligence harder for the Germans, and growing Soviet air superiority limiting German reconnaissance flights. The information war was turning.
But hiding the troops is one thing. What about supplying them? The logistics must have been monumental.
Colossal. The Red Army used a flexible administrative plan, leveraging their vast railway network, often building temporary lines right up towards the front.
And they just had this incredible ability to mobilize resources, didn't they, and replace losses.
That was a key advantage. Huge reserves of manpower, and crucially, industrial production that was hitting its stride, churning out tanks, guns, planes at an accelerating rate.
By 1943, this resource advantage would become overwhelming, but it was already significant by late 42.
Absolutely, and we shouldn't forget the impact of Allied Lend-Lease aid.
Especially the trucks and jeeps.
Yes, things like 17,000 jeeps and 90,000 trucks provided crucial mobility. They played a key role, especially later at Kursk, allowing the Soviets to move troops and supplies rapidly, something their own industry wasn't yet fully capable of providing at that scale.
Okay, so the trap is meticulously prepared. Hidden in plain sight. The forces are gathered, the weak points targeted. November 19th, 1942, the moment arrives.
The code word siren is given. Operation Uranus begins.
And it began with fire.
An overwhelming storm of fire. Thousands of guns and mortars opened up, but the most terrifying were the Katyushas, the Stalin organs. Rockets screaming towards the enemy lines.
Primarily hitting the Romanian positions.
Yes, the initial barrage was devastating for them. Communications were instantly shattered, forward positions obliterated, ammunition dumps went up in spectacular explosions, panic set in almost immediately.
This opened the door for the main assault, the pincers.
Exactly. Two massive thrusts. The Southwestern Front, attacking from the north, the Stalingrad Front from the south, Soviet armor, the T-34s, supported by infantry and even cavalry.
The cavalry. In 1942.
Still effective in the wide-open steppe for exploitation and cutting communication lines. They tore through the lines held by Romania in the Sheath Corps on the southern flank, for example, and just rushed inwards, aiming to meet the northern pincer.
And the impact on the Romanians was catastrophic.
Immediate and total collapse in many sectors. They lost around 55,000 troops, killed, wounded, captured on that first day alone, leaving a gaping 50-mile breach in the Axis front.
The encirclement happened incredibly quickly.
It could. A textbook double envelopment. The two pincers met near the village of Savetsky just 4 days later, on November 23rd.
And there's that anecdote about the link-up.
Yeah, elements of the 36th Mechanized Brigade from the south and the 4th Tank Corps from the north. Apparently in the fog and confusion, they initially mistook each other for Germans and briefly exchanged fire.
Before realizing they were on the same side, a moment of confusion turned into jubilation.
Precisely. That moment was later reenacted for the newsreels, of course. A powerful image of the trap snapping shut.
So, the trap closes. What was the German reaction? Or maybe the lack of reaction?
Alarmingly slow initially. News of this massive offensive didn't even reach the 6th Army headquarters until 9:45 that morning, hours after it started.
And General Paulus, the 6th Army commander.
Incredibly, according to some sources, he ordered his tanks inside Stalingrad to continue mopping up operations in the city ruins. He completely failed to grasp the strategic significance of what was happening on his flanks.
Still fixated on taking the city itself while his entire army was being surrounded.
It seems so. Hitler, however, reacted differently. He quickly grasped the encirclement, but came up with his infamous brainstorm.
The air bridge.
Yes, resupply the entire 6th Army, over 250,000 men, by air. He based this on the perceived success of the Dmansk pocket airlift earlier that year.
But Stalingrad was a completely different scale.
Massively different. Dmansk involved maybe 100,000 men and needed about 270 tons of supplies daily. Stalingrad needed, realistically, 700 tons, minimum.
Later adjusted down to 550 tons as a bare minimum for survival ammo, fuel, food.
And what did they actually receive? In that crucial first week, just 350 tons total for the whole week.
An impossible situation. Fighting without ammo, freezing, starving.
Luftwaffe commanders on the scene, like Fiebig and von Richthofen, knew it was impossible. They warned Berlin vehemently. They calculated needing at least 225 Ju-52 transport planes flying every single day.
Which was a huge chunk of the Luftwaffe's entire transport fleet.
About a third of it. Utterly unfeasible, especially given the other demands on the Luftwaffe and the conditions.
The conditions being blizzards, deep mud.
And the constant threat from the strengthening Soviet Air Force. Plus, the airfields themselves were vulnerable. First, the distant ones like Tatsinskaya and Morzovskaya, 150 miles away.
Making the flights long and dangerous.
And then, inevitably, the Soviets started capturing those forward bases, forcing the airlift onto the two main airfields inside the pocket, Atomnik and Gumrak.
Which were under constant artillery fire and air attack.
Exactly. And the Soviet Air Force was getting stronger. New planes like the Yak-9 fighter, the P-2 bomber, the Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft.
Yeah.
They were challenging and often beating the Luftwaffe.
The days of easy German air superiority were over.
Decisively over in that sector. German transport losses mounted horrifically.
While this disaster unfolded, what was happening back in German high command? Was there dissent?
Oh yes, significant dissent, especially between Hitler and the chief of the general staff, Franz Halder. They had stormy scenes. Halder was apparently appalled by Hitler's refusal to see the danger, his continual underestimation of enemy possibilities.
Halder predicted this flank attack, didn't it?
He did. He kept warning about what would happen when Soviet reserves hit the overextended flanks. For his troubles, Hitler sacked him, replaced him with Kurt Zeitzler.
And Paulus on the ground. He must have known the situation was hopeless.
He absolutely did. His reports became increasingly desperate. Army headed for disaster, only food for 6 days. He pleaded for permission to break out.
But Hitler refused. Hold Stalingrad at all costs.
Exactly. And Paulus, despite recognizing the air bridge was unrealistic and a breakout was the only chance, couldn't bring himself to willingly disobey the Führer. That oath of loyalty, that military discipline, it paralyzed him.
Even Manstein, brought in to try and relieve Stalingrad from the outside, ultimately told Paulus to obey Hitler's orders.
It's a complex situation. Manstein clearly despised the high command's handling of it, but the chain of command held. Loyalty, denial, and perhaps a fear of Hitler kept the Sixth Army trapped.
The conditions inside the Kessel, the cauldron, just deteriorated.
Horrifically. Remember that broadcast from Major von Zitzewitz
Yeah.
about rats eating a sleeping man's frostbitten fingers? That somehow got out.
A glimpse into the absolute hell it had become, while official propaganda back home was still talking about heroic defenders.
Goering dismissed reports like that as defeatist messages. Zeitzler, the new chief of staff, apparently cut his own rations down to the level of the men in the pocket in solidarity, losing a lot of weight very quickly. A silent protest, perhaps?
The endgame was inevitable as the pocket shrank and the airfields fell.
Tatsinskaya, the key external base, was captured just before Christmas 42. The scenes there were apparently pure chaos. Planes taking off under shell fire, collisions on the runway. A Soviet T-34 even rammed a Ju-52 transport plane,
Symbolic. Then Potomnik inside the pocket fell mid-January 43.
leaving only Gumrak, the last battered airstrip. When that fell, the air bridge, already a failure, was completely finished. The last hope was gone.
Which leads to Paulus's surrender, but not before one last bizarre twist from Hitler.
January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler taking power. He promotes Paulus to field marshal.
Knowing full well no German field marshal had ever surrendered.
It was a clear signal: fight to the death or commit suicide. Paulus's reported reaction was furious and bitter. I have no intention of shooting myself for that Bohemian corporal.
His final act of defiance against Hitler, in a way.
Perhaps. The very next day, January 31st, Soviet troops reached the basement of the Univermac department store where Paulus had his final headquarters.
The final message went out. Russians at the entrance. We are preparing to surrender.
A Soviet delegation entered. They found Paulus, despondent-looking, reportedly just wearing a sweater. His field marshal's uniform hung nearby.
The surrender was formalized, and yet the official German news that day.
Stalingrad. Situation unchanged, the defender's spirit unbroken. A complete fiction to maintain the myth for the German public.
So the battle ends. The Sixth Army is destroyed. What was the immediate aftermath, the impact?
It was seismic. For Germany, it was unequivocally the greatest single defeat in the history of the German army. The Sixth Army, plus parts of the Fourth Panzer Army, were just gone. Army Group B was routed.
Annihilated.
Annihilated. Germany declared 3 days of national mourning unprecedented. The psychological blow was immense. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was gone forever.
And for the Soviets.
A massive boost in morale. Proof that the Germans could be beaten decisively. It shifted the strategic balance on the Eastern Front permanently in their favor.
Germany had to pull troops from other fronts to try and plug the massive gap.
Exactly. Weakening them elsewhere in North Africa, preparing for Allied landings in Europe. Stalingrad had global repercussions.
It's widely seen as the turning point in the European war.
Almost universally regarded as such. The most important military-political event of World War II. A point of no return for Germany's hopes of defeating the Soviet Union.
The beginning of the end on the Eastern Front.
And it had wider political effects, too. It stopped Hitler's drive for Soviet oil, resources he needed to fight the Western Allies.
And it reportedly discouraged potential Axis allies, like Turkey and Japan, from joining the war against the USSR.
A critical factor. As historian John Erickson famously said, if Poltava in 1709 turned Russia into a European power, then Stalingrad set the Soviet Union on the road to being a world power. It reshaped the geopolitical landscape.
And internally, for the Soviet military, it was a catalyst for change.
Definitely. Stalin, seeing the success that came when he trusted his generals, seemed to learn a lesson. He recognized the practicality of using his experienced commanders and generally gave them more freedom going forward.
And the Red Army itself showed incredible resilience.
Astonishing resilience. They suffered roughly equal losses in men and equipment at Stalingrad as the Germans did in the encirclement, but they recovered rather quickly.
How?
Through those large reserves of manpower and that rapidly increased industrial production, they could absorb blows that would have crippled other armies and replace losses at a rate Germany simply couldn't match anymore.
Which brings us to the comparison with Kursk. Operation Uranus versus Kursk, two huge Soviet victories, but different in nature.
Very different, and they show the evolution of Soviet strategy. Kursk, Operation Citadel for the Germans, was in July-August 1943. It was Germany's last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front.
After Stalingrad, the Soviets basically held the strategic initiative, right?
Pretty much. The Germans tried to wrest it back at Kursk, throwing everything they had into one massive pincer attack, but the Soviets anticipated it.
So how did the operational art differ between Uranus and Kursk?
Uranus was fundamentally offensive. A classic double envelopment designed to encircle and destroy. Risky, audacious, and reliant on that brilliant deception plan.
Kursk was defensive first.
Exactly. The Soviets knew the attack was coming, thanks partly to intelligence, like the Lucy spy network providing exact timings. So they prepared incredibly deep defensive belts.
Designed to absorb the German attack, bleed them dry.
Precisely. Let the Germans smash themselves against the defenses, then launch powerful counteroffensives, Operation Rumiantsev and Kutuzov. It was a much more deliberate, mature strategy. Defense followed by offense.
So intelligence played an even bigger role at Kursk.
Arguably, yes. Knowing the exact start time allowed for that devastating largest artillery counter-preparation of the war. It caught the Germans completely off guard as they were forming up.
Contrast that with German intelligence completely missing the buildup for Uranus.
Or failing to shield their own preparations for Kursk. The intelligence gap had widened significantly in the Soviets' favor.
And the resource difference was even more stark by Kursk.
Overwhelmingly so. By spring 43, you're looking at nearly 6 million Soviet troops, facing less than 3 million Germans on the Eastern Front.
And the equipment ratios, tanks, guns, planes.
Just staggering. Roughly 6,000 Soviet tanks versus maybe 1,300 German machines involved in the offensive, 20,000 Soviet guns to 6,300 German, nearly 3,000 Soviet aircraft against 2,000 German.
That tremendous Soviet material advantage was undeniable by Kursk.
It shaped everything. While still present at Uranus, it became a defining feature by Kursk. The sheer weight of numbers and material was becoming decisive.
And command maturity, Stalin's role.
Kursk is seen as a peak moment. For the first time, Stalin fully deferred to the wise counsel of his military advisors, accepting that initial defensive phase, even though his instinct was always to attack.
Trusting Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky.
Exactly. It represented the ultimate graduation of the class of 36. Those commanders who came through the Reformed General Staff Academy survived the purges and were now masters of operational art.
Vasilevsky, Antonov, Vatutin. They understood deep operations, combined arms warfare.
And they executed it brilliantly at Kursk. It showed how far Soviet military thinking had come since the disasters of 41 and early 42.
And Maskarovka, the deception. Still important.
Absolutely. The Soviets used the lessons learned at Stalingrad and advanced their skills in masking their formations and intentions even further by Kursk. They became masters of hiding vast armies.
Combined with air superiority and better radio security, it left the Germans increasingly guessing.
They were often fighting blind, unable to get reliable intelligence on Soviet strength or intentions, a complete reversal from the early war.
So, wrapping this incredible story up, Operation Uranus, born out of the hell of Stalingrad, was this profound turning point.
It really was. A moment where desperation, brilliant planning, meticulous secrecy, and sheer logistical effort came together to change the course of the war. It proved the Red Army could not only defend, but could mount complex, decisive offensives.
And the lessons learned there about planning, deception, logistics, adapting, they obviously shaped Kursk and the rest of the war. But do they resonate beyond that?
I think they do. Even in modern military thought, or even outside the military context in complex problem solving, the importance of deep analysis, understanding weaknesses your own and your opponents, the power of misdirection, and the absolute necessity of robust logistics. These are timeless principles.
It's a powerful example of how adaptation and learning, even from your enemy, can overcome seemingly impossible odds.
Definitely. And maybe a final thought for you to ponder is just how that transformation happened, how an army pushed to the brink fighting for mere survival in the rubble could conceive and execute such a complex strategic masterpiece like Uranus. It suggests that sometimes the greatest strategic advantage isn't just brute force, but the ingenuity to see and exploit the vulnerabilities your opponent doesn't even realize they have. Finding the blind spots, that can be the key.